we all learn, so that we all learn a little bit about who's in the room today. I know that we have many different experience levels. So if you could raise your hand, either using the virtual function or just raise your hand physically, if that's easier. If you've been in this field, let's start off with for 20 or more years. Could you raise your hand? We've got some people there. How about 15 or more years? About 10 years? 5 or more? How about a year? Great. And a big thank you goes out to the Maine Credit Union League for their technical support for this Elder Abuse Summit. So throughout the program, please put any questions that you have in the chat. So these could be your general questions about the program, technical questions, or questions for our speakers. We've got committee members, Chris Wolf and Dana Morrill, who will be monitoring the chat box and make sure that your questions are brought to the attention of the speakers. So you should have gotten a message that we're recording the program, and we will be posting the recording to the Maine Council for Elder Abuse Prevention's website. So if you do need to leave early today, that's an option for you to view the program. Thursday's program will also be recorded and posted to the website. And this program's been approved for a maximum of 4.25 continuing legal education credits for attorneys. And so if you'd like us to report your attendance, please email me. I'll put my email in the chat. Include your bar number and your email, please. And for other disciplines, we'll provide certificates of attendance, and we ask that you seek approval with your licensing authority. So I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Erin Salvo, the Associate Director at Adult Protective Services. And if you're looking for more detailed information about any of our speakers today, I'd refer you to our biography information that was emailed to you. So now I will turn it over to you, Erin.
Good morning. Can folks see my screen and hear me okay? Great. Thank you for the introduction, Jill, and thank you to MECE for putting on this event. I know those of us in Adult Protective Services always look forward to attending and getting together with such a large group of individuals who are passionate about what we are, which is preventing adults from being abused, neglected, and exploited. My presentation that I will be giving this morning is really an overview of our Adult Protective Services program, with a focus on some of the data that's just recently become available to us through some partnership with the University of Southern Maine Cutler Institute. I will try to keep an eye on the chat, but I will jump into questions as I'm able to, and we'll reserve some time at the end for questions as well. Really, for anyone who's not familiar with Adult Protective Services, we are a program within the Maine Department of Health and Human Services within the Office of Aging and Disability Services. And the state law that governs everything that we do is the Adult Protective Services Act, which requires that we protect incapacitated and dependent adults from abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and situations that present a substantial risk of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. This does include allegations of self-neglect, which I'll get into a little bit later in the presentation. A little bit more about how our program operates. We have a statewide team that's primarily based in our DHHS district offices. We have really an APS investigation team, as well as our public guardianship program. And we have about 50 investigative caseworkers around the state, 8 supervisors. And then for our guardianship program, we have about 50 caseworkers as well, and 7 supervisors. We have a central intake unit that's based in Holton. And we have a very small team at our central office that includes myself, our public guardianship program manager, training manager, client asset management unit that's connected to the public guardianship program. One thing that I always like to begin by mentioning when I talk about adult protective services is that we, as I mentioned in the slide earlier, we work with clients who are dependent and incapacitated. Those are really critical definitions that drive much of what we're able to do and who we're able to work with. And the definition of dependent is quite broad. Anyone who relies on others for care and support. That's not the statutory definition exactly, but it includes anyone who resides in a nursing facility or assisted living facility by definition. And as I mentioned, anyone who relies on others for care and support due to a diagnosis or limitation. We work with anyone who's 18 or older who meets that definition. And the important piece here is that dependent being such a broad definition compared to incapacitated, we recognize that adults have the right to take risks, to live in circumstances that may be dangerous, that others are concerned about. And if someone is dependent, but they do not lack decision-making capacity, then our services are voluntary, and it is someone's right as an adult to tell us that they're not interested in engaging with us. And we have to respect that right. So we do recognize that as sort of a core piece of our work. While we're very focused on protecting folks, identifying safe circumstances to the extent we can, we also take very seriously our duty to promote individuals' right to self-determination. If someone lacks capacity, if they're someone who meets that definition of incapacity, which would be someone who is unable to receive and evaluate information to make and communicate decisions to the extent that that would leave them unable to meet their essential requirements for health and safety, things can change in terms of what we're able to do. And that's where we get into the track of exploring potentially guardianship, which again, I'll talk about a little bit later. But I always like to start with really kind of framing that out, what it means to be a client of Adult Protective Services and where that is largely a voluntary choice by many of our clients. So I'll turn to really kind of a piece that will lead into the rest of the discussion and our and some of the data points that I'll be highlighting today. In 2019, Governor Mills signed an executive order that established the Elder Justice Coordinating Partnership, which was a group of both public agency representatives and private sector organizations that were tasked with developing the Maine Elder Justice Roadmap, which was published in the winter of 2021. And what this group was responsible for doing was coming up with recommendations to improve elder justice in the state of Maine. And I know there's a session on this, so I won't get into the details, but there were 4 primary areas that we were focused on. And you'll see those on the slide: direct victim services, public and professional education, public policy, and then data collection and evaluation. And one of the recommendations that was highlighted in the roadmap was having more public adult protective services related data available. We collected a lot of information as part of our investigations, and that's within our data system that we call Evergreen. And really want to be able to share a lot of that data so that we can have more discussions. What does this tell us about the clients we're serving, what we're able to accomplish, what we're not able to accomplish, and kind of continue to drive some of that coordination to affect change and generate justice ultimately. So with that, the department entered into an agreement with University of Southern Maine Cutler Institute that worked with us to extract data from our system and pull together a report that will be made public later this month. And we identified the last 2 fiscal years worth of data to produce this report. So you'll see it in full, but I have a handful of snippets here that I'll be sharing and walking through as I talk about our program a bit more. For those who don't live in the world of fiscal year, that's going to be fiscal year 21 represents July 2020 through June 2021. And then fiscal year 22 is July 2021 through June 2022. So jumping right into what we include in the report, everything that Adult Protective Services does begins at our central intake unit. And what we've been saying for many years is an increase in the volume of reports that we've seen. So even just looking at 2021 to 2022, we had about a 10% increase in the total number of reports that we screened in statewide. And when we say screened in, that means someone made a report to APS and it met the minimum criteria that necessary for us to explore it further and get it assigned to a district office for review and caseworker assignment. That criteria includes the person lives in Maine, the person is 18 years old or older, the information we have suggests that they are someone who would meet the definition of a dependent or incapacitated adult, and the circumstances that are described by the reporter include allegations of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or the substantial risk of one of those. Related here, I also included information about the way we receive our reports. The vast majority of reports come through by phone, which makes sense because one piece of the Adult Protective Services Act requires mandated reporters, the bulk of the reporters that we see, to report by phone. We do offer an online option. There's a link on the DHHS website to a form that individuals can use to make a report. And that is the next largest way that we receive reports here. But this aligns with what we would expect to see where we have primarily mandated reporters making our reports. So I believe in 2021, only about 26% of our reports come from non-mandated reporters, which would include individuals, family members, neighbors, friends. And that number jumped to about 33% in 2022, which also aligns with when we began a public service announcement campaign. For the calendar year 2022, we ran a public service campaign via radio. There were some Facebook ads and other social media ads. And we think that may have driven a little bit of that increase in the members of the public who are not mandated reporters making our reports. I know too that there were the vast majority of reports that we receive come in during business hours. Our intake line is a 24/7 phone line, but only about 10% of the calls we receive or reports we receive come in during the non-business hours, weekends and holidays, and the others are during our business hours. That said, while our phone line is 24/7, our investigators are conducting the investigations during business hours as well. So even if we receive a report on a Saturday, for instance, the earliest that would get assigned would be on the next business day, Monday. Speaking a little bit more about mandated reporters, this isn't the full list of mandated reporter roles, but you can see here the top categories of reporters. So unlicensed assistive personnel and individuals who are identified as an other caregiver that doesn't meet one of the below definitions are our top category generally, and then followed by social workers and nurses. So this is incredibly helpful data for us to have, so we know who's making reports to APS and who we need to connect with to make sure they have the information they need to report to APS. And also, just understanding the various settings that our clients are in when we are receiving a report. So turning to what are individuals calling and reporting to APS? You can see here the highest percentage of the type of allegations that we receive is self-neglect at 37%, followed by caregiver neglect at 26%, and so on through financial exploitation, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse and exploitation, and then other types of exploitation, which can include things like medication diversion. I will say that one feature of the annual report that will be public soon is that we broke out some of this type of information into more demographic, client-specific information. So what do these allegation types look like if we're looking at our clients who are over 60 versus under 60, or individuals who are involved in receiving developmental services versus individuals who do not have an intellectual disability or autism. And it does look a little bit different depending on what quadrant, so to speak, we're in. So I think that's a key piece of information that we've included in the report as well, though I didn't include all of that detail in the presentation today. When we're at the stage of conducting an investigation where it's been assigned to a caseworker, what the very first feature of an investigation is going to be our safety assessment. So attempting to connect with the client as soon as possible within our timeframes to assess, are they safe immediately while we review the allegations. From there, we want to see, are there services that could be established or made a connection for the client if they're willing to go that route, and really with a focus on sustainability. So we know that it's not uncommon for someone to interact with APS and for us to have future interaction with them, more than one report on the same client. But to the extent we can identify a sustainable plan that will decrease the likelihood of that happening, we want to go that route. And we do have some exciting programs underway right now that I think are helping on that front. There's a session, I'll plug a session of the summit that's happening on Thursday about one of those projects, which is called RISE. And we're really seeing some excellent outcomes that clients who are connected with that program don't return with a repeat allegation of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Of course, another feature of the investigation process is conducting interviews. We want to understand the circumstances from the client's perspective. If there's an alleged perpetrator involved, we're required to at least attempt to interview that person. Others who may have witnessed an event or have more information about the circumstances we'll interview. We also will collect documents, and if it's appropriate under the circumstances, whether that's medical records, a client's financial records, particularly if there are allegations of financial exploitation, and review those and see how those might fit into the situation as well. And I would say it is far more common than not that we're collaborating with other organizations during an investigation. So we regularly are working with law enforcement, with long-term care ombudsman, legal services for the elderly, Elder Abuse Institute, a whole range of organizations that are designed to also support older adults and adults with disabilities. Ultimately, with that safety piece established and working through that, we also are trying to work towards identifying what are our findings. Is this a case where we have enough information to substantiate the allegations? Are we finding that they are not accurate, and so on? And then we document that finding or those findings within our data system. And then I'll also mention that if there is an allegation or the individual that is the client of Adult Protective is believed to lack capacity, we may be in a situation where we are conducting what we call a guardianship study, exploring whether the person requires a substitute decision maker, and if we need to proceed with a petition to the probate court to pursue public guardianship, which is considered protective services within our authority as APS, but is an absolute last resort when it's necessary and there are no other less restrictive options to pursue. Also, I will note here, included in the report, currently, or the most recent fiscal year, and the average number of days from when we received a report at intake to when the case was closed was 48 days, down just 2 days from 50. I generally don't like to compare state to state adult protective services systems because they are very, very different. But I do know the national average for an APS investigation is closer to 55 or 60 days. So we're a little under that average in terms of our time frame to close out a case. I'm just going to pause here and take a quick look at the chat and make sure I'm not missing any questions. Okay. Turning a little to some of the demographic information that we have. We do know that 2 out of every 3 APS clients are 60 years old or older, and about 83% of our clients do not receive developmental services. Among our clients who are not receiving developmental service, so individuals who do not have a diagnosis of intellectual disability or autism, the largest group by age are clients who are 70 to 79 years old. And we have some more detail around this type of information within the report. But just so you can kind of see the breakdown of clients that we're working with based on age. And I mentioned as part of our investigations, we are making a decision ultimately about whether we can substantiate allegations or not. Here is how that broke down for the 2 years that are within the report. We have categories of substantiated, unsubstantiated, and unable to determine. And sometimes unable to determine means we weren't able to get enough information. Maybe the client left the state before the investigation ended and we weren't able to interview all the parties necessary or something like that. Or there's kind of a major piece that we weren't able to establish. But ultimately, you can see the substantiation percentage is about 20% of the investigations that we assign. And as I mentioned, we break out sort of some of the information that we have into the developmental services and non-developmental services categories. And you can see here that with respect to our clients who are not receiving developmental services, self-neglect is the highest category, whereas clients within the developmental services system, caregiver neglect is the highest category with a substantiation rate of 30%. And self-neglect falls way lower down the list in terms of the substantiation rate. So this data really helps us kind of frame what interventions may work for different populations at different ages. There's really kind of a lot here to dive into, but kind of want to give a snapshot of sort of those areas that are within the report as well. When we think about who are the perpetrators, this is the information that is related to our non-developmental services clients, the highest category here being family members as our perpetrators in substantiated allegations at 62%, much higher than the next category of a care provider, which is 18%. I will note here that, as I mentioned, we conduct guardianship studies if there is an allegation or concern that an individual lacks capacity to make decisions and needs a substitute decision maker. Only 1 in 100 reports on average for both of the years within the report reflect that ultimately public guardianship was pursued and that the department was appointed as someone's guardian in our cases. And that kind of concludes my slides, but I know that there is a lot to talk about in terms of adult protective services. So I'm happy to take questions on any of that information.
Do we have any questions for Erin? I'm not sure if we had any in the chat or if
No,
people
I
would
don't
just
see
like
any
to-
questions in
Okay.
the chat room. One question is, do these stats reflect paid versus family?
Generally, if someone is both a caregiver and a family member, they're going to be categorized as a family member. So we don't in our system have a way to check off multiple boxes in that way, but caregiver itself would encompass both paid caregivers and non-family, non-paid caregivers.
Can you give an example of when a guardianship is needed?
Yes, so there are the probate code dictates the process for appointment of an adult guardianship. And as I'd mentioned, public guardianship is then a very last resort from there. So ultimately, there is a medical determination from someone's medical provider that an individual lacks the decision-making capacity to make and communicate informed decisions to meet their basic needs. From there is really required to be an exploration of whether there's a less restrictive option to guardianship. Could someone benefit from a supported decision-making arrangement, a team type of arrangement for support to make decisions, assistive technology, and so on? Sometimes someone having a rep payee-ship or power of attorney already established can alleviate the need for guardianship. So exploring all of those less restrictive options. And then ultimately a determination that guardianship would be necessary and appropriate to meet the person's needs for health, safety, and their welfare. So that's kind of the basis for an appointment of a guardianship that the probate court is undertaking. As part of our guardianship study, we're looking at exploring each of those three pieces. And then if we conclude as APS that it does sound as though guardianship would be appropriate, we look into, is there a private party who would be able and willing to serve and appropriate to serve as an individual's guardian? And then we will sort of work with them to see if they're willing to take on that role. You know, it's also possible, and we do see instances where there's a private guardianship in place, and that's the person who is the alleged perpetrator in an APS investigation. In those cases, we may pursue public guardianship to ask the court to terminate that private guardianship in favor of public to protect someone from a perpetrator who has been serving as their guardian. So this is not an example, I realize. This is just like a full-on overview of the guardianship process, but we do see, it can look many different ways. So in some instances, there's an individual who has had some cognitive decline, maybe as a result of a dementia diagnosis, and they don't have someone in their life who's able to take on the role of making their decisions. So we would, assuming all of that process has played out, we would then pursue guardianship and ask the court for authority to make decisions on that person's behalf. And that can involve helping to determine what residential placement, what type of setting the person would be able to live in safely, and how to expend their assets to support their care and meet their needs on a regular basis. I will say a really key tenet of our public guardianship program is that we are continuing to promote self-determination to the greatest extent possible, even if someone lacks capacity. So the idea is that as much information as we can gather about a person's individual preferences, beliefs, we want to support those. So a very obvious example, if someone has lived their entire life in Aroostook County, we're not going to say it'd be really more convenient for us if you lived in York County. Why don't we have you move down here? Because wouldn't be likely aligned with that person's personal beliefs and values. So we do take that very seriously. It's only in instances where making the decision that we believe the person would make if they were able to, if that would put someone at risk, put their health and safety in danger, then we move to really sort of a best interest analysis. And those are all very carefully considered conversations and, that happen daily. So we're looking at decisions that relate to residential, financial, medical, and we have a team that makes those types of decisions together on a regular basis.
So we have a bunch of questions that came in while you were talking.
That's
Jillian.
why I gave the long answer, Chris, so that I could stack
So
up the
Jillian
question.
has kind of 3 questions all lumped together. Maybe this is going to be too much, so I can break them up. But she said, her question is more so how often are employees of agencies found substantiated, and how long does the substantiation process take from allegation to registry? And are registries in the entire US or Maine only?
Okay. We do have a process that involves a registry, which I didn't get into in the general presentation, but I'll mention that a little bit more here. So I don't have the data in front of me on how often employees specifically of agencies are found substantiated, though I think that's something that we do have available. And what this question is getting at around the registry is that we currently have an Adult Protective Services perpetrator registry. Right now, it's limited to situations where the client involved had an intellectual disability or autism, and the perpetrator was found to have abused, neglected, or exploited the client. That's something that has been, our authority around that has been expanded by statute, and we are working on adjusting our rule, our formal rule that will allow for us to proceed with adding other perpetrators to that registry, where it won't be limited by the client's diagnosis in that way. That's what we call right now a level 1 substantiation. So what happens in those situations is the perpetrator, where we have substantiated allegations of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, receives a notice that says, we've made this finding, and that person then has a right to appeal because it's going to be on a public-facing registry. If that person proceeds with the appeal, they go through an administrative hearing where a hearing officer hears the evidence that APS has collected, hears from the alleged perpetrator, and makes a determination that then gets reviewed at the commissioner's office level to be upheld or overturned. If it's upheld, or if the person doesn't appeal, then that person's name can be put on this public-facing registry that provider agencies are generally required to check as part of their hiring process within the developmental services programs. That process can take there's a pretty wide range of time, I would say, that process can take. I believe the individual has 30 days to appeal. From there, there's the scheduling. There may be some back and forth between attorneys, and ultimately awaiting the decision of an administrative hearing officer. So I don't think I can provide a clean answer around the time frame for that substantiation process to play out. And was there a third piece of that one? Oh, the registry. Our registry is Maine only. It doesn't feed into any kind of national registry. And I know that, as I mentioned earlier, Adult Protective Services really varies widely state by state because it's driven by state law. So some states have registries, many do not, and there's just a wide range of approaches that states take around that process. So our registry is limited to Maine, and it is not connected to any larger US-wide registry.
Do you handle financial violations yourselves or transfer them to financial institutions?
We investigate allegations of financial exploitation. We do not, there's no process for us to assign them back to a financial institution. What we often do in financial exploitation cases is seek someone's records, and that could be from one financial institution, from several, and then try to piece together how that all fits into the picture to determine if there may be financial exploitation happening. From there, we are often looking at seeing if we have enough information to be able to provide that to a prosecutor. Work with the Attorney General's office and also more local law enforcement agencies to determine whether there's sufficient information to pursue charges related to financial exploitation in particular.
So this got a few comments. So they're curious about how many of those substantiations result in a direct care worker being listed on the direct care worker registry. And can the registry include private pay caregivers, whether someone hires them directly or they go through a private pay agency? And is the registry capable of listing individuals who act in a home health care capacity without any sort of license or certification?
I'm trying to find the question just so I can make sure.
It started with Hillary Fernald.
Sorry. Okay. The Direct Care Worker Registry is maintained by the Division of Licensing and Certification. So there is a connection, but it's slightly different. So I don't have data on that readily available. And I would say that it can include private pay caregivers. One feature of the way the registry is structured right now is that really the sole criteria, other than substantiating an allegation of abuse, neglect, exploitation, is that the client has a diagnosis of intellectual disability or autism. So the perpetrators who may be included on the registry could be paid or unpaid. Anyone who's in a caregiver role in that way. So it's not limited to main care providers, for instance.
What are some of the signs of financial abuse?
So one sign of financial exploitation would certainly be if someone seems confused about what's going on with their money. Certainly if someone has expressed that they've signed anything that they don't understand. We've seen that. I'll kind of mention this or respond to this question with an example. And we do, although financial institutions are not generally mandated reporters, we receive reports from banks on a regular basis. And we know a lot of older adults still bank in person and they're regular customers at their local branch. So some of those reports come in because a teller who's had the same customer for many, many years is noticing a change. They're noticing a change in appearance, hygiene, how someone's just disposition has changed, who had been, upbeat and happy is now kind of more confused or concerned, or with someone that they're not usually with, who doesn't seem like they're being a strong support person for them. And those calls from tellers are often spot on, where they've identified a real change and real concern, and that there's something going on with the client. So I think with respect to signs of financial exploitation, in many ways, they're not that different from signs we ask people to be on the lookout for, sort of those red flags, or really a big change for someone may be a sign that there are some additional questions to ask. Or certainly if someone's with a caregiver or a support person and they seem fearful, or they seem like they don't really want to say much in the presence of that person. So I think a lot of it is can be sort of a gut reaction, sort of that see something, say something. And I always, encourage folks to err on the side of caution. You don't have to know every detail of the circumstances to make that report. That's what we are able to look into as part of our investigation.
And what, if any, control does a guardian have over placement?
What, if any, control does a guardian have over placement? That can depend, or that certainly depends on the authority that's been granted to us by the court in any specific guardianship. So when we petition for guardianship, we're either asking for full guardianship or limited guardianship, where we would be seeking only certain types of decision-making authority for someone. So first, if court order says that we have authority to make residential decisions, then we would be exploring that again, focused on what the client has expressed as their wishes for where they would live, what level of care the person requires for their health and safety, and what's available. So we can do signing paperwork for admission into a residential care facility and things like that, but really want to focus on what's gonna meet someone's needs and what are they going to be comfortable with to the greatest extent possible.
So this, I don't know if you can speak to this or not, but this person says, we're finding that it's harder and harder to get public guardianship in place with a PP 505, and if the patient has no one available to assist. Is this something others are running into? I'm sure that everyone's at capacity, but we have seen an increase that is concerning, as some of these patients are not capable of making their own decisions and have little, no family able to assist.
I don't know if that's a question. It doesn't sound like that might be a question for me necessarily.
It
But I
just,
can say, I think one piece we do receive several, many reports that are with concerns that someone lacks capacity, and that the reference to a PP 505, that's the medical document that's required to be filed with the court from a client's medical professional, whether that's a physician, nurse practitioner, and a few other medical professionals are permitted to fill out that form. But I mentioned when I was giving a little bit more of an overview of guardianship generally in our process to petition, that having that medical determination isn't always, really isn't the end of the analysis the court's considering. And so I think that that's one thing we do see, is that we have a medical determination that someone lacks capacity. There are other kind of hurdles that we have to meet to get to the point of a court being in a position to appoint guardianship.
okay. We have a raised hand, and then we can, if we still have time, we can finish the last questions that we have.
So my question, I don't know if you answered it, was specific to, and I know this is a certain spectrum and an audience here, but there's long time confusion about what disciplines we're supposed to report to, like adult protective. So more like for the UAP registry and that law, I don't know, were all disciplines captured there now, or like there are questions sometimes, do adult case managers get reported to this? Do daily living skills task staff? I mean, we know that DSP and PSS and nurses do, but there's always been this really gray area about, did adult case managers ever make it into the law, and did the other disciplines that weren't included? We report obviously everybody that's working, right? But the question is always, can you do something about it if there might not be a law that puts them on the registry? Specifically like case management and mental health workers, are they included in the registry now? Did that rule get expanded?
So the law that changed related to the registry eliminates the requirement that the client involved is someone who has an intellectual disability or autism. So it now says that anyone who has, a caregiver who has abused, neglected, or exploited an incapacitated or dependent adult is someone who can be placed on the registry. That's not something we've been able to put into practice yet because we're working through the rule changes, but that's the goal and that will be the change soon. So it's there's not a list of professionals who then are on the registry. It's really very broadly defined as someone in a caregiver role, and that doesn't. It's not. The idea is that it's not limited to paid caregivers. It can include both paid and unpaid, and then can include both professional, formal caregiver relationships and informal. So it is quite broad in that way. I hope that answers your question.
What advice or information can you offer regarding interstate APS referrals?
It can depend on the state. As I mentioned, I think, there are different jurisdiction requirements that states have around who they're able to serve. So I know some states don't investigate self-neglect, or some states don't have APS going into facilities. They only visit people who are in their own homes. So we don't always know all those details when we're reaching out to another state, but I think that we have had some success, especially with our other New England states coordinating when that's been needed, and either calling their direct intake line or seeing if we can connect with their central office. And I do meet regularly with other administrators, especially of the New England states, to kind of compare notes. What are folks seeing out there? And we have that opportunity to connect through that network as well.
Curious if you are seeing there is a struggle with long-term care beds for elderly that need nursing assistance, and if DHHS is having this internal conversation about how to address this issue.
Yes, certainly.
Does a guardianship appointed by the court take priority over other probate court, or is this process held up by the court's availability?
I'm not sure. I think I may need a little bit more information to make sure I'm understanding the question.
Nicole, do you want to unmute yourself and clarify that question?
I was just curious as if the guardianship was important to get in place, if it goes ahead of all the rest of the docket at the probate court, or is it just based on the availability of getting assigned a slot type thing?
Gotcha. Okay, I understand now. So we do have, there is a process for pursuing an emergency guardianship, and then a process for a non-emergency guardianship. The bar for pursuing an emergency guardianship is very high. And the reason for that is because some of the back and forth, some of the procedural steps that happen that help establish due process are eliminated or really shortened. So what the court is looking to do is only hear something as an emergency guardianship if there's a really high risk of danger to the person if a guardian is not appointed. So for instance, we've pursued an emergency guardianship if someone is living home alone and they have a dementia diagnosis that's progressed to the point where they're wandering, not able to find their way back, and it is middle of winter. That situation, we may go to the court and say, this person is at serious risk of harm. If a guardianship isn't established, where we can help make some residential decisions on their behalf. In those cases, there's an additional document that we supply to the probate court, an emergency affidavit, and that does get before the court much more quickly. so that the court can make a short-term decision about the need for guardianship immediately. If it's not doesn't meet the criteria for an emergency guardianship, then we are kind of on the list somewhere for what else is going on with the court in terms of how far things are being scheduled out. So, and that can fluctuate, and it may depend on the county we're in, just the volume that they're seeing through the probate court at that time.
So 2 final questions. The first one is, are there still 2 separate hotlines, one for ID and one for all others, or do you combine them?
We have one APS intake line, 1-800-624-8404. I should have put that in my slides. I usually do. We also recently added a 207 number, which if anyone did happen to hear the radio commercials or see those ads, we have phone number 207-287-1234. So 2 phone numbers that land in the same place. It all goes to our same intake line and is reviewed by the same group of individuals.
So this last question is a little tricky. They ask, as community providers, how can they help to improve the image of APS from authoritarian to a helping profession? There's still a lot of stigma, and people are afraid of APS and nursing home placement.
That's a good question. I think that we know that there are a lot of barriers that cause people to be anxious about working with APS, and there is sort of that long-standing concern of, that we have broader authority than we do to remove people from their home, and that's the standard. So I think, I'm grateful that we now have more data to show things like it's very rare. It's really, again, that last resort situation where we would be pursuing something like public guardianship. And even then, our goal is to work with someone to try to pursue what they would like to do as much as possible. I'm sorry, Chris, I wasn't able to find that one in the chat to kind of keep.
It was a private
Okay.
message to me.
And yes, so Libya, who's one of our APS investigators, has added to the chat. She's there to see if there are any unmet needs, any services and supports able to help them with. And I think that's a great answer. We want to be able to support more than anything, and work with individuals.
And we have one final hand raised.
Sorry to be that person, but I was on a bunch of these committees in the beginning, so I'm excited to see it finally get combined. So there's no longer 2 different numbers. There's one, because it was always the ID autism line that was separate from the APS. But my question is, do we still gain access to level 1 information, or does that still go through that one person at the department? That's the only person that has the information, and you got to send, an email separate from your whole registry check to see if there's any high level findings that the registry didn't used to have.
We have an email box. It's not an individual person's email, and I'll plug that into the chat. I
just remember it was Harry Toby for
it's no longer a specific email to Harry. We have sort of a APS checks type of email, but I'll make sure I get the exact email right, and I'll plug it into the chat. And that is the process to conduct the checks currently.
So that's the only place you can get that high level 1. It won't show up, because I don't think a lot of agencies know that, so they miss that step of those high level 1s, and then it might come back to you because the person couldn't work for you and they never ran it through. So I just think it's something that needed to be added, because I don't know that everybody knows about level 1s not being on the registry.
Yeah.
specifically for ID, I think, and autism, the really high level, serious ones are very confidential.
Sure, yep. And I'm seeing I did get a direct message question, which is, what are your educational strategies for the pursuit of guardianship so lay people are able to understand this option, or is it left to the legal system? Which is a really good question, and I think a complex question as well. So certainly, as I mentioned, if someone's in need of a guardian and we are able to identify family member or friend or someone involved in the person's life who's willing to serve in that role, we'll encourage them to pursue guardianship. And I don't think there are very many formal trainings available to what it might mean to be someone's private guardian in Maine. And we can, in some ways, talk about what our process is and what we do, but oftentimes are advising someone to work with the court, contact the probate court directly and ask those questions to figure out what is going to be required of them as a private guardian. And it can be difficult to, some folks can find that difficult to navigate, but there are resources that exist. It usually just starts with outreach to the court. I want to be someone's private guardian. I'm ready to be someone's private guardian. What steps do I need to pursue?
So this is a great comment to end on. This person says, just want to thank APS for quick engagement with elders struggling with mental health and spousal alleged abuse, which we could not prove at our standard, but which did result in essentially rehousing, protection, and meeting their needs.
So Erin, I just want to say a big thanks for presenting and sharing all the information, an overview of Adult Protective Services. I did have just one question I wanted to ask. I was just curious in looking at this data, was there something that was surprising to you as someone who's, working in the system every day, reviewing reports and cases and, yeah, just wondering about that.
That's a good question. I think I don't think any of it was surprising. I think that I was mostly, if you can use this phrase, pleasantly surprised. Say, look, this does align with what we think we're seeing. We know that self-neglect cases are very, very challenging in many situations, and that we're seeing quite a bit of them. But to have, showing that reflected in the data, getting a sense of that volume increase that we're continuing to see, it's all kind of supported by the data, and it really, for me, sort of starts to help me build more questions. So, as we're looking at this data, what else does this tell us, and what else do we want to explore here? What other kind of categories could we pull out information and see, what are the differences, and how could we target different populations or approach different types of allegations that we're seeing. So, like I mentioned in the report itself, which will be available later this month, we have other information, more detailed information than what I covered today. Things like the length of time an investigation is open is sort of tied to what allegations we're exploring. So we see that a financial exploitation investigation is open a little bit longer than other types of investigations, for instance. So that's something that we just didn't have access to before, and it's good to be able to see it and then sort of see if there are questions we want to dive into a little bit more, or approaches we want to try to pursue as a result. So I would encourage, that will be released on the DHHS website soon. We'll, I think, also send a notice out through our listserv if anyone does the Gov Delivery listserv through the DHHS website or the ODES website, and to take a look. And if there are other questions or areas of data that you think would be valuable for your organization's coordination with APS, we're, excited to have this opportunity to share it and learn from it.
Well, thank you so much, Erin, for taking your time to share with all of us the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you all.
So,
But there's one more comment.
oh, I see. Okay.
So this, Jackie says, my office, CCDA's office, is actively looking for appropriate cases to pilot the RISE program. We need an elder being harmed by a family member with an active charge, including substance use involvement, and the family member needs help through our treatment court and effectively restorative justice with the elder if and when appropriate. Please feel free to contact my assistant if such a case comes to mind in Cumberland County. And she gave her contact information there.
Great. So before we kind of turn to our morning break, so that we can all learn a little bit about who's in the room, our backgrounds, and maybe how many times we've attended these events, we do have a couple of poll questions. So Ellen, could you launch the first one? So hopefully you can all see.
Is it just me? Because the poll seems frozen on my end.
Being here.
I do see some responses, so
There are 2 questions. You have to scroll down to the second before you can hit submit and answer that.
does it seem to be working now for whoever was having trouble?
Yeah, that was the problem.
Great, okay. All right. So Ellen, if we end, can we share the results now? So, so who's with us today? So you can see we have 11% elder services providers. We've got 6% healthcare providers. 14% are adult protective services workers, victim advocates at 7%, law enforcement 3%, 11% are attorneys, 18% of social workers, counselors, mental health providers, financial services at 4%, and then we've got 27% other people, other disciplines. And then how many years have you attended the summit? As I said in the opening, this is our 9th, so it's hard to believe we're already at year 9. 33% of you have never attended before, so that's great. We're really happy that you're attending. Hope you'll be back next year. And then the largest percent after that would be people who have attended 3 to 5, 29%. Are pretty regular attendee. All right. So, so the plan, so let's all take a break. Please stay logged in, but feel free to turn off your cameras and to stay muted. We'll be back here at 10:45 where, Erin spoke about financial institution employees as really often seeing those first red flags that there's financial exploitation happening. So we're really pleased. We've got two of those staff people from financial institutions who will be talking about what they're seeing. So see you all shortly. We'll be restarting in about 3 minutes. So let's go ahead and get settled back in, everyone. Hopefully you had a chance to stretch your legs. One thing with Zoom, it's a lot of sitting. So hopefully you had a chance to take a break from the screen. Next up, we have financial institution staff. We have Kim Turner, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Maine Savings Federal Credit Union, and Debbie Whalen, who is the Vice President of Fraud Mitigation at Maine Savings Federal Credit Union, who will be joining to tell us a little more about what they're seeing. So I'll turn it over to Kim and Debbie, and Ellen, you'll screen share.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jill. Thank you for that introduction. I just want to get a quick sign that everybody can hear me. Perfect. I also want to take a moment to give a shout out to Erin on her presentation. Erin, you have a very difficult job and you are a wealth of knowledge. And I just wanted to thank you for everything you and everyone else at Adult Protective Services in your efforts to protect Maine citizens and providing them with resources that they very much need. Getting back to the presentation, Debbie and I are excited to be part of this panel today, and we hope that the information we present will give you a deeper insight into the complicated schemes that fraudsters pose to society. Some of this information definitely overlaps with financial exploitation that a lot of you unfortunately have to work through. But today's presentation is very much geared toward the fraud activity that exists today that we find people of all ages, but particularly people that are maybe a little bit older. Maybe loneliness is injected into that, that they are victim to. Ellen, go ahead and advance the slide. The Federal Trade Commission, it is the FTC's mission to protect the public from deceptive or unfair business practices and from unfair methods of competition through law enforcement, advocacy, research, and education. I bring this website to your attention because they are a great resource for information on fraud. And if you haven't visited their website, I would highly encourage you to visit www.ftc.gov to see the wealth of information that they continually publish. I would also encourage you to sign up for the different types of consumer alerts that they post. I think that they provide, they are a great resource, as I mentioned, and they provide great material to help you stay current on the different fraudulent activities that occur. Ellen, if you could advance the slide, that would be great. Thank you. From ftc.gov, they publish annual statistics on reported fraud. This information allows you to see areas of high reported fraud, the specific number of fraud reports that were submitted, and the amount of fraud losses, and the different types of categories of fraud that were identified in the different reports. Advance the slide, please. So breaking it down for 2021, there were almost 3 million fraud cases reported. Reported is definitely the key word. You can't help but think what the number would be if every fraud situation was reported. The cases reported amounted to over $6 billion, and the top two types of fraud were romance scams and computer takeovers, sorry. Ellen, go ahead and advance the slide, please. And these are the stats for 2022. We'll go over them in the next slide. Feel free to advance it. So breaking them down for 2022, the number of fraud cases reported dropped to 2.3 million, but the amount of losses jumped to 8.7 billion. The top two types of fraud remain the same, with romance scams and computer takeovers. Please advance the slide, Ellen. Thank you. So if we take 2021 and we compare it to 2022, there were 553,714 less cases of fraud reported, but the amount increased by $2.7 billion. So if you look at it as at a standpoint of the average amount of fraud per fraud case, in 2021, this equaled just over $2,000, and in 2022, it equaled just over $3,700, increasing by $1,604.13. So if we put that all together, there were less cases reported, significantly less cases reported. And again, I'm just going to inject the thought of what wasn't reported, and the amount of amount per fraud case almost doubled from 2021 to 2022. That's pretty staggering information. Ellen, if you could advance the slide. There are many types of fraud that exist. Some types have been around for quite a long time, while others have evolved, particularly as a result of the use and availability of technology. They use that to leverage their tactics and they leverage technology to enhance their tactics. For example, it is extremely easy to take over a person's identity using information and pictures that are publicly made available. And it is easy to spoof a telephone number or even buy a burner phone that is hard to trace. So I'm going to quickly deviate because I think that it is important to understand the concept of spoofing. Spoofing a telephone number is when someone disguises and deliberately falsifies the information transmitted to your caller ID. The Caller ID Act was signed into law in 2009, making it a criminal offense to spoof a telephone number. But I'm sure that the reality is that it is very difficult to trace and get to the bottom to actually pursue conviction of that. So it is a technique that fraudsters use to lure you into their deceptive acts. It is an effective way for fraudsters to get you to pick up the phone. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the presentation. But getting back to the types of scams, what this all means for society is that it is often difficult to know with 100% certainty that you are speaking to or interacting with the actual person that you believe you are in communication with. This is often true with dating sites or social media forums. It is very scary and unfortunate, but it is the reality in the world we live in today. This slide lists some of the most common fraud situations that we see here at Maine Savings Federal Credit Union. As I stated, some of these have been around for quite some time, but fraudsters identify areas of weakness to leverage their capabilities of fraudulent attempts. I mention that because computer takeovers are something that we are increasingly seeing. This could be done through a cold call, probably someone using a spoofed telephone number, someone that might state that they're from a reputable company like Microsoft, someone that is purposely injecting fear with the tactic that you have a virus and need control of your computer, and they need control of your computer to remove it. This could also be done by accidentally clicking on a link on a website that has malware or a virus attached to it, where the fraudster could gain access to your computer. In either of these situations, if you feel that something isn't right with your computer, or you're helping somebody kind of navigate this situation, shut it right down, literally shut it down, unplug it, shut it down, and schedule an appointment to get your computer looked at by a professional. Ellen, could you advance the slide?
Let's take a few minutes to talk about a fraud situation that happened to a member. The story of Mr. I lost my entire savings. A man who was a longtime member had lost his wife due to health reasons. He was financially stable, wasn't wealthy, but had saved money over time to build a nice nest egg that was there to allow him to spend more than his monthly Social Security deposit. He grieved the loss of his late wife and felt that there was something missing. He wanted a companion. He decided to subscribe to a dating website. Next slide, please. For him, was it love at first sight? It might have been love at first text message or first phone call, but he never met this person in person. The calls were consistent. They were engaging. They gave him confidence, empowered him in a way he hadn't felt in years. He was on cloud nine, feeling wonderful because someone was giving him the attention he had longed for. He was in love. They spent hours each day talking over the phone, but never in person. Next slide, please. The fraudster had gained his trust and requested money. She said she was in the hospital and couldn't leave until she paid her hospital bill. Mr. I lost my entire savings was in love and wanted to help. He didn't think twice. It started out as a small request, but the request wasn't a one and done. They came in fast and furious, and before he knew it, he spent all his money in his savings. He had borrowed against his home, his truck. He took out a personal loan and maxed out his credit cards. Next statement. Next. The reality for him was that he didn't have any money in his savings, and he now had $85,000 in new debt, which equal to new loan payments of over $1,000 a month. He was on a fixed income of just over $2,000 a month, and this debt took away half of that. Next slide, please. There is more. As I mentioned, he had accumulated over $85,000 in debt. He was so trusting over his new love. They'd accepted money that wasn't his, and he sent these funds to the fraudster. This was in addition to the money he already gave the fraudster. He moved a total of $135,000 to the fraudster. Next slide, please. Where did all his money go? We wish we could tell you, but we can't. What we do know is he mailed a lot of it to via UPS. He was coached on how to package it so it wouldn't be traced. We also know that he used some of it to purchase gift cards and gave the information off the gift cards to the fraudster. Next slide, please. Maine Savings started tracking the individual fraud cases that we are aware of or have been reported to us by our members. The numbers are incredible. In January, we saved members $106,000. In February was $158,000. In March was $170,000. In April was $136,000. Through the end of April, this totals $570,000. If this trend does continue, we expect to see our members involved in fraud totaling over 1.7 million. Next slide, please.
Red flags are signs of abnormal situations. Erin touched upon this in her presentation. They are triggers that you should be aware of, and when observed, you should ask questions that probe deeper into the situation. Some people are very sensitive about things that relate to their privacy, but this should be overlooked when you feel that something isn't right. Conversations and questions can be handled in a delicate way to gain a sense of understanding related to the different red flags. Oftentimes, people are coached by the fraudsters as to what to say or do. Oftentimes, when they are being coached, the fraudsters are extremely successful, and it may be hard to get the truth to the situation. Providing reassurance that you understand that you might be overstepping, but you are concerned, is essential to that conversation. Gaining their trust to untrust the fraudster is a process. Allow yourself to ask clarifying questions to their answers. Jot down notes if you are able to during these conversations, and go back over the things that don't make sense. For example, conversation might be something similar to this. You said this earlier in our conversation, and now you're saying this. Help me understand better. Sorry for the number of questions. I just want you to know that I'm concerned and I want to understand. As a result of a question or statement like that, they may tell you that it is their money and they can do what they want with it. That right there is a big red flag. This can be really hard to navigate through, and oftentimes people are so consumed in the moment that they can't think long term, and they overlook how they will continue to provide for themselves and their families. To simple things like buy groceries, paying rent, having money to buy oil or gas, they're not in that headspace. These are things that should definitely be brought up during your conversations and questions. Red flags can include a new sense of secretiveness. Someone's personal appearance has changed for the worse. This could be a result of additional stress that is being put on the person because of threats that a fraudster is making. Lack of focus, another red flag that shouldn't go unquestioned. You seem different, like you aren't able to focus. Is everything okay? Something as simple as that could really start a conversation that could help the person get out of the situation they're in. Another red flag is unusual spending. A lot of times we hear from people that are involved with fraudsters that the money is going to be used for home improvements or to buy land. Inquire about the mention of new friends, especially if these new friends are calling or texting a lot. There could also be a sense of being scared, especially if they're being threatened. This could lead to a person isolating themselves. Next slide, please. Fraudsters do not discriminate. I've had the unfortunate opportunity to see a fraudster take a few $1,000s from someone just over the age of 18. Someone so young, not having the funds to pay back the money that was lost, and someone that was extremely shamed by the fact that she fell for their tactic. Don't know about anybody here, but money is money. And if I'm fortunate enough to have extra money, I want to donate it to a good cause, not to a fraudster. Imagine for a second not having much in your savings and or checking account, and then being responsible for paying back a few $1,000s when you can barely support yourself. This is an all too common type of situation. Fraudsters will prey on people that are vulnerable because they are often successful in gaining their trust and their money. This could be someone looking for a companion.
Like, you have treats for me?
Like the story that Debbie shared. Or someone that has a heart too big to say no, and their innate desire is to help. Fraudsters invest so much time in gaining your trust. They are extremely relentless in their efforts and their tactics. And as I've mentioned before, they will use threat mechanisms to scare you once they've gained your trust. They will often tell you that authorities will bring you to jail or you'll be assessed a fine if you don't do what they tell you to do. They are extremely, extremely relentless. Next slide, please. How do we protect ourselves, our families, and our friends from fraud? For me, the first thing that we can do is we can talk about it. It is real, it is happening, and it is not going away. It is only becoming more complicated, and it's becoming more frequent. Don't click on random links that you find on the internet. Do not share your personal information. Don't share your personal information. I could say this a million times and still not feel like I'm being heard. When you feel yourself about to do this, pause, allow yourself to think through it, walk away, talk with somebody about it, a friend, not your fraudster friend, but a true friend, a family member, or even a professional. Tell them what you are trying to do and ask them if they would feel comfortable doing it. Have that conversation. Whatever you are trying to do will be there once you give yourself time to think through it. Nothing is immediate. Let me repeat that important element. Nothing is immediate. We can all give ourselves permission to walk away. A lot of times we react differently in times of urgency. And when we reflect on that reaction, we oftentimes wish we would have given ourselves just a few minutes to pause. Please put this at the top of your mind the next time you feel yourself reacting out of a sense of urgency, and allow yourself to pause momentarily to think through the decision that you really want to make, not instinctively want to make, but thoughtfully. We see so many people give out their personal information, their date of birth, their social security number, their mother's maiden name, their bank account information, their credit and debit card numbers. There are certain things that can't be replaced. We were all born on a certain day. We were all assigned one social security number, and our mother's maiden name will never change. It is critical, so critical, that this information is protected to the best of our ability. There are definitely things that can be changed, your bank account number, your debit card, your credit card, but still, it's a hassle. So if you don't have to change it, that is definitely the route that you want to go. Lastly, don't engage with conversations with anyone that refuses or makes excuses for not meeting you in person. That is a huge red flag that is often overlooked, particularly with romance scams. Next slide. Don't engage in conversations with people you don't know. If they cold call you, hang up the phone and block the number. If they threaten you, take the time to think about the overall situation. Give yourself permission to call the agency that is supposedly out there to arrest you or give you that incredible fine. If that's what you need to do, please give yourself permission to do it. Get that confirmation. If you are concerned about the legitimacy of a call, for example, someone calls you saying they are with your financial institution, take down their name and tell them that you'll call them back. Those extra steps are very important. They could be spoofing a telephone number, just like I had mentioned before. They could tie that telephone number, that spoofed telephone number, to your financial institution. So spoofing, as a reminder, happens when a fraudster takes a real telephone number and makes it seem like they are calling from it. If you take that time to hang up and call back, you are calling the true number. As an example, in this case, you would be calling your financial institution back and not the fraudster. However, they may try to convince you to call them back at a specific telephone number. Don't call them back at that number. Call the number that is publicly available for the organization that you are trying to reach. Do not get intimidated by their sense of urgency. Hang up the call and call back the person directly. Don't wire funds to anyone you don't know. This surprisingly happens more than anyone can imagine. Reflecting on the situation Debbie shared, don't accept a wire or checks or any form of cash, or money from anyone that you haven't met in person. Do not put cash in the mail. This also happens more than anyone probably can imagine. Fraudsters will coach you and convince you that it is okay to do this. It is not okay. They will give you detailed instructions on how to package the cash. Big red flag. Like I mentioned earlier, visit www.ftc.gov, read through the information that they publicize, educate yourself, and sign up for their consumer alerts. Next slide, please. As we were putting together this presentation, I couldn't help but feel that this message could be impacting somebody in our audience today. So for me, with that thought, This is definitely the hardest slide in the presentation for me to present, because this can be very real. So what if this is your reality? How do you move forward? Before we dive into the steps on the slide, know that you are not alone. If this is your reality, make today the day to escape the conversations that are happening. Talk to somebody you trust, a family member, a trusted friend, someone at your financial institution, a member of law enforcement, could be somebody at your doctor's office, a professional, somebody that can provide you with honest, unbiased opinions about what is going on. This can be very difficult. So you really need to focus on shifting that vulnerability from the fraudster to somebody that you trust. It is going to be very difficult for you to articulate all of the different things that have happened in the past or are happening right now in the moment. But be completely honest in your conversations. Don't hide anything. Please be as transparent, as honest as you can be. Immediately stop all conversations with the potential fraudster. Don't even tell them you know about them and what they are doing. I can't even stress how important it is to stop the conversations. This includes the conversations around why you are not continuing the conversations. People often feel the need for closure, especially in these situations. And I will be very honest and abrupt, and some of you might think that this is kind of like common sense stuff. But let me tell you, when you're caught up in the moment, it's far from common sense. The fraudsters do not care a single bit about closure. They really just care about getting your money. That is the honest truth and the bottom line. They do not care about closure. They just care about getting your money. So when you realize that this is your reality and you've made the decision to stop all conversations, block their number from contacting you. You'll want to pause and give yourself time to collect your thoughts. Take time to regroup. Get in line with the true reality. Sit down somewhere and take that time to reflect on how it started, how you got here, and create an understanding that there will be work to undo all that has been done, but that with some focus and determination, some guidance, you will get through this. This will most likely be such an emotional process. Give yourself time to let these emotions out. I would encourage you to file a report on the FTC website. As we saw in the beginning of the presentation, the reports are used to help educate other people and assist the FTC in their efforts to protect consumers. Chances are that either money was exchanged with the fraudster, or they gained access to your account, or have your debit or credit card information. So it's important to involve your financial institution. They could have even gained access with your username and password to online banking. So when talking with your financial institution, explain to them what has happened. Be honest and forthright with the different things that have occurred. It is so important to let us know all of the different details. This helps us understand the scope and determine what steps need to be taken on our end to help protect you. If your account number has been given out or obtained by the fraudster, we will work with you to close it down and open a new one. Seems pretty easy, but there are a lot of moving parts, but we're here to help you along the way. We will also help you change your home banking login information or shut down your debit or credit card, and we'll reissue a new one. We could even establish a password to put on your account. For when you call into the credit union, we could verify your account with the password. Speaking of passwords, it is extremely important to change all of your passwords, not just for online banking with your financial institution, but pretty much for any site that you have a login with. It's always a good practice to change your passwords periodically anyways. So this really complements that and will give you that peace of mind knowing that everything has been changed and is fresh and is now secure. As you go through this process, it's going to be very overwhelming and you will feel pretty defeated. You'll ask yourself questions, but just know that you will get through this. Also remember that the fraudsters are extremely relentless. They will try to persuade you to continue the conversation. They will also harass you if you don't block their telephone number. I have seen members in our employees' offices explaining the situation that they are facing related to fraud, and the fraudster is calling them and doesn't stop. It's pretty enlightening. It's very scary. And I understand how the fraudsters can be so successful in their efforts. Next slide, please. Thank you for the time Thank you for taking the time out of your day to attend this summit, especially this presentation. Debbie and I hope that you found it to be informative. Remember, we work hard for our money, and the reality is that it can quickly disappear. Fraudsters are extremely good at taking money from innocent people, and they carry no guilt in their actions. Fraud is not going away, but collectively, with effort, we can do our part in protecting ourselves and those that we love. Remember, give yourself permission to pause and ask if everything seems right. Listen to your intuition and take steps to protect yourself and anyone that you might feel that is communicating with a fraudster. Next slide, please. At this time, we will respond to questions. You can either put them in the chat or under the reactions icon, you can raise your hand and we will answer as many questions that we can. If there aren't any that we are able to assist with, we will take them as takeaways, and Jill will make sure to distribute that information post summit.
Thanks so much, Kim and Debbie. So we'll open it up now for any questions. Chris and Dana, I don't know if we have any questions in the chat.
Not yet, just a comment from someone about an upcoming webinar that people might be interested in. So if you haven't noticed that, take a look at that in the chat. This person gave the connection for it, and it looks like it could be a great opportunity if people want to learn more. There is one question that just came in. Are some of your victims, once their money is drained, pushed into money mule work?
That is unfortunately our reality. I don't think that sometimes we realize that we are a money mule until it's brought to the attention. Asking oftentimes those clarifying questions will lead to that self-discovery in that situation. But anytime money is sent to potentially promote terrorist activities, or to a fraudster, you are technically a money mule at that point. It's
Can you
a
explain-
hard reality.
Before you go any further, somebody asked, what is a money mule? What is that?
So a money mule, great question. It is a person that is working with a fraudster or potentially a terrorist to move money. These requests that come through, typically we see them in the form of wires. So when a member comes in and they request a wire, or maybe they submit a wire request online, it is our duty to ask what the intentions are. What is the purpose of these funds being moved from you to this person or business? A lot of times we are successful at stopping that movement. But once that money has been moved from your account to a person who is either involved in fraudulent activity or terrorist activity, you are a money mule. And if you think about that movement, the fraudsters are their intent is to get that money to do whatever with it. Chances are it's not a good intention. But they are very successful in getting multiple people to move chunks of money to different people, and then it all eventually silos to a place where they have access to the cash. So it's very complicated. That $10,000 that you were asked to send to my sister that is being held hostage in Dubai, that money is probably then moved multiple times further down the road to an account somewhere that the funds can be accessed and used in a non-legal way.
And
So does that help?
This goes to this next question, and I think you talked a little bit about this, but when the money is wired, is it able to be followed or identified once it's gone?
Yes and no. From our standpoint, once the money is wired, our efforts to recover that money are pretty non-existent. If it's done in a certain time frame, we have a higher chance of recovering that money, but it's still it's very rare that we're able to recover, get that money back.
Does losing money sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish.
So it takes the effort of law enforcement to actually trace the steps. So, we send out a wire to, I'm just going to pick on, I don't know, like Bank of America, for example, and that person receives the wire at Bank of America. They may then wire it to another person or multiple people. So it's very perpetual and very thoughtful as far as getting that money to that centralized location. But their intent is for it to be difficult to trace, and that is often the reality. Is it's very hard to trace, and we very much rely on the efforts of law enforcement and different agencies to help us trace that activity.
Does losing money to fraud affect the ability of individuals to access income-based state or federal resources with a look back periods? I know we've run into this with our work, like and I think legal services could speak to this too, like just that look back. If you've been financially exploited, how does that affect your ability to get state and federal help for housing or any of those services?
I know our attorneys have run into this. I don't know if we've got a staff attorney. I see Hillary put something in the chat. I don't know if somebody would like to speak to that.
I can speak to that with regard to Social Security benefits. If somebody's on a needs-based Social Security benefit and they are a money mule, money's passing through their account, Social Security will terminate those benefits and you'll have to appeal. We've had some success with that, but Social Security appeals take months, sometimes years, and during that period, the person may have no income.
Wow.
Extremely scary.
We have some more questions in the chat.
This
Chris?
question is, I'm curious, when does law enforcement get involved or advocate agency as well? Question to Erin from APS, are they collecting data of adults being abused online? Example would be romance scams.
We do have data at the allegation stage of our investigations where we break out financial exploitation by fraud versus something more direct. Often what we're seeing is financial exploitation that's happening at the hands of a perpetrator who's known to a client. That's more common what we experience, but we do break out scams versus a perpetrator who's known to the client. But I don't have that data readily available today, unfortunately.
Do you have statistics on how long will a fraudster pursue someone before giving up? If they find someone who will talk with them but doesn't bite immediately, will they keep trying for a week, a month, longer?
I
Don't
can answer
have
that a
any-
little bit.
Oh, go ahead. Thanks,
Yeah,
Debbie.
Kim. Yeah, we don't have the statistics on that, but I can tell you that we've seen, what I've seen is if we're here at the institutions, if we haven't noticed it or something, because I've seen one go on for 6 months, and when we finally got involved, it was too late to go back and try to help and recoup money and to get their money back. But most generally, when we catch it, it's a lot easier to be able to help them in the beginning to be able to help get some of this money back. But it can happen. I have someone that just, they seriously, we can only do what we can do, right? We can only try to help, and they would text them after we told them time and time again. But what they tell them to do after the fact is go to another institution, open up a new account, so that your institution won't ask questions, because now you've taken them out of, you've taken those people out of the routine. And, we've had a situation where that's truly is what happened. They went someplace else, deposited it, and then brought us the money to move that money, which, again, they were the money mule of moving money that was not theirs. As we said in the presentation, that was a true, one of the true things, that people are getting money that's not theirs. And come find out from the other end, they were romance scams. So these people that thought that they were going to see their love and going to meet their love, they're not going to. They actually send it to somebody else that is taking that money and moving it to that fraudster. So needless to say, that fraudster has been involved with probably 3 or 4 of those people and pretending to be the one that's in trouble and needing help or whatever they're looking for. So it's hard to predict You can lose. We've had somebody that's lost their whole life savings because they didn't listen to us, and they just kept emailing them, and you know, they're lonely. These people are lonely. So if there's no family around to help, it makes it a little difficult.
There are a couple comments, you know, people can report these instances to FBI's Cybercrime Task Force, and it looks like it's ic3.gov in the chat. And then people can report scams to the Office of the Maine Attorney General's Consumer Protective Division. Another question, can you explain the difference between an authorized transaction like a wire from an unauthorized transaction?
So I can take that. I'm Ellen Parent. I'm with the Maine Credit Union League. I'm the Director of Compliance. And so I also wanted to just answer a comment that came in before, which is when does law enforcement get involved in financial crimes like this? So financial institutions are required to file what is called a suspicious activity report when they have a suspicion of some sort of financial crime or funding of terrorism or other illegal activity. So they also can report that to law enforcement, depending on the circumstances and how aware they are of whether or not a crime is actually being committed. So an authorized transaction is going to be a transaction where the consumer actively makes that transaction. So, you know, you're the one putting in your card number, you're the one using your going into your branch and asking for a wire to be sent. So there are a couple of an unauthorized transaction would be something like someone has gotten your login information and has made a transaction on your behalf that you're unaware of. There are some in this field, some nuances with if someone has given their card to a family member and said you can use this for one thing but not another, then you've got a little more work to break down. But just wanted to fill in with a couple of those since it's a little more technical.
Thank you, Alan.
What is the time frame of when financial institutions can help and potentially get funds recouped? Does that even exist? Is it like minutes, a day? Like, is there any time frame?
It's very dependent on where the funds went to. And if that financial institution still has possession of them, and if that financial institution is willing to send them back. It's very rare that we have been successful in those efforts, but we will always try.
And then there was a comment saying once all the money is drained, the scammers will contact the victims to offer to recover the scam funds if the scam person sends them more money. So there's always somebody out there. Hillary says recovery scams, home rescue, warranty scams, so many scams of already vulnerable people looking for assistance. And then postal inspectors work on scam cases also. So that's another area of assistance. In cases where the victim doesn't listen to authorities and continues to communicate with and be a money mule, at what point would the victim be liable?
What was that question, Chris?
In cases where the victim doesn't listen to authorities and continues to communicate with and be a money mule, at what point would the victim be liable?
That's a tough one, Kim. That's a tough one because we kind of talked about that and with the an FBI situation, and it becomes where they do get, my understanding is a letter would be sent out from the FBI to let them know that they are aware of what they're doing and it does need to stop. I haven't seen what one of those letters look like, of any sort, or never have we had to go to that extent ourselves to be able to help somebody, again, stop doing what they're doing. They're, again, by switching institutions, they're doing it again. So we're just not aware of it, or, unless it involves us. But to my knowledge, like I said, I'm not 100% sure how that would work.
So I also have some experience in this field, though Maine Savings has not experienced it. There are other credit unions who have dealt with this. When a money mule, obviously, when a money mule becomes personally liable, that's going to be a prosecuting decision, that whatever the whichever level of prosecutor is going after them will have to take into consideration. We've mostly seen it recently with scams surrounding COVID relief funds. But a general rule of thumb is once they start exploiting other people, there becomes a much more likely chance for them to see some personal liability. But again, that's going to be very dependent on situation and dependent on what the prosecuting office decides.
Christina, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, I work for Adult Protective Services and I am one of the financial abuse specialist team. So I specifically investigate the fraud and scams and other financial exploitation cases. And I've been in the position for a couple of years, and I've had one experience where there was an interstate fraud case, and they actually did prosecute the money mule, where the reason why they did is because they were notified of a situation where this money mule was involved in a year prior, and they went out to her home and spoke with her, very definitively explained what she was involved in, told her not to do it. And then I got involved a year later, and my client was sending money out to the same individual, and she was found to be continuing these activities. So they did determine that they were going to charge her for that. So, but that's I just wanted to share my experience, because I've had one case where that has happened. And I just wanted to just kind of clarify, because I asked the question around the time frame, because both you, Kim, and I think Deborah had kind of mentioned that, there is some time frame that you may be able to recoup funds. So I was just trying to get a sense, because I get a lot of reports that are directly from the financial institutions. Either they're involved more often that I have the financial institution reporting to us than a client is coming up with it for us to notify the bank. So I guess I just wanted to get clarification on, is there, because I think sometimes with different law enforcement, the families I work with and myself kind of just get the message that you're never going to get any money back. And so I don't think there's anything ever pursued to the next step. So I kind of was just trying to narrow it down to say, well, look, if this has been caught in within the first month or a couple days or whatever, they could call the institution directly and maybe get some further assistance on.
If it's within the same day, I would say that it's worth asking the financial institution to see if there's a possibility to recover those funds. The wire process is pretty instantaneous. So moving that money is very quick in nature, which I believe is why the fraudsters look to have that done in that fashion. But there could be potentially an opportunity to recall those funds. I believe I've only seen it successfully done like one, maybe two times. Usually once it hits the receiving financial institution, it's gone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any
So
other
I see any more
questions?
questions in the chat box?
I did have a quick question to Ellen's comment about the privacy laws where they don't reach out to an advocate. I was just hoping she could kind of explain those laws a little bit more. Because it's like the exact opposite in social work and healthcare. So I was curious about that.
Sure. So financial institutions are covered by the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which if it might be useful to think of it as sort of like the HIPAA, but for financial institutions. So we're not permitted to disclose any information that relates to a consumer's accounts, their transactions, things like that. Now, they can make, financial institutions are now permitted to make reports to APS if it's a dependent or incapacitated adult, or they suspect that it is that the consumer involved is a dependent or incapacitated adult. There also are some exceptions for reporting things to law enforcement, but generally speaking, we're not permitted to, like, we couldn't reach out to a private advocate and say, hey, I think this person is being, you know, these transactions have been suspect. They certainly can, if they think there's a crime being committed, which financial exploitation is, they can report that to law enforcement. That's generally what we recommend. There is also, there's some reporting capability to the Maine Office of Securities. So there are a couple different avenues where they can report, but generally speaking, as financial institutions, we're not permitted to disclose anything about an individual's accounts. You really can't even say this person belongs to my institution. And that's something that we all appreciate, right? You don't want your financial institution to be providing, you know, information about your accounts to whoever they see fit. So this is really just to protect members. It is a sort of a rough situation. A few years back, there were some legal changes to allow for more sharing in situations like these, but generally we're not permitted to share information.
I think that's it for questions. Is that right, Chris?
Yep.
Yeah. Great. Well, we'll go ahead. Oh, Nicole, you had I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that a couple of things. I wanted to give kudos to Deborah and Kim for catching as much of that fraudster money in the first 4 months, and just think if every financial institution had that to report, that's pretty amazing. That's just amazing just from one financial institution, but they all are out there being well trained to identify those red flags and to report it. And they are reporting it to those suspicious reports because I see them weekly. And just a comment to Christina Logan, who asked how quickly or is it possible to get a wire back? And I agree with Kim Turner. I see it very rarely. And I think she also mentioned that it requires the agreement of the receiving financial institution to return them. So there's lots of different moving parts. And so I think the best way to prevent it is to prevent it from happening to begin with. So can't stress enough to make sure you talk to your family, friends, neighbors, make sure that they're doing okay, and make sure that they're reaching out to the appropriate people for friendship, and rather than somebody on the internet that they don't know. So great presentation, ladies. Great information.
Thanks, Nicole.
I do always tell Debbie that I hate fraud, but it keeps her employed. So, and if we didn't have fraud, we would definitely find a new thing for Debbie to thrive on. So, but I really do wish that fraud would go away and that people would redirect those very awful intents to doing better or good in this world. Can you imagine what we would be, what kind of world we would be living in if all of that money that is used for fraudulent, illegal activities, if it was used for the purpose of good?
Exactly.
Thanks, Kim. So on that note, we'll wrap up today's session. A big thanks to all of our speakers and all of you for the great discussion. You had great questions, and so it's wonderful to hear all the different perspectives. So please join us Thursday afternoon, May 18th, for the second half of this Elder Abuse Summit. And we'll email certificates of attendance for today and Thursday after both sessions. And so if you're unable to attend Thursday's session, be sure to visit our website to learn about our World Elder Abuse Awareness Day plans. We have graphics that can be downloaded and shared on your social media accounts. And Ellen, could you screen share the website so we can give everyone a preview of what's there? So you can see there's our social media plan, and then you can scroll down and you can actually just click on these graphics to copy them, and then you can paste them right into your social media account to help spread awareness of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. And so also we'll be sharing a survey link after Thursday's program. And so, please let us know how we did. We want to make sure this is a good use of your time. If you have ideas for future topics for summits, we'd love to hear them. So please be sure you complete that survey. And thanks for attending, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.